and on about this skills gap, but there's not a skills gap. There's a morality gap. There's a refusal to offer on-the-job training. There's an insistence that people go and get expensive credentials and expensive degrees for jobs that shouldn't really require them. You know, there hasn't been this magical shift in people's intellect or ability. It used to be you could enter a job on the ground floor in a plant, you know, like the Chevy plant in Lordstown, and work your way up and learn those skills there. And I don't see why they can't do that, you know, with new kinds of jobs, you know, with jobs, as was said, related to the Green New Deal, with other types, you know, of cars. And that is something that people, you know, they owe these workers that, you know, it's cruel, it's unnecessary, and it can be fixed if people have the will.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah Kinsey. Or Heather, can you come back? I want to talk the Green New Deal in like a lot greater detail. So definitely want to have you come back and do that. Thank you both very much. Really appreciate it. And coming up in our next hour, we're going to do a special 1-hour edition of AM Joy. We're going to devote it to all the potential crimes of one Donald J. Trump. So brew yourself some coffee, and we'll be right back. AM Joy. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen refused to call a cage when she appeared before a House panel that was investigating Donald Trump's border and family separation policies. She struggled with semantics even more when New Jersey Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman asked her this.
What is a chain link fence enclosed into a chamber on a concrete floor represent to you? Is that a cage?
It's a detention space, ma'am.
Does it differ from the cages you put your dogs in when you let them stay outside? Is it different?
Yes.
In what sense?
It's larger. It has facilities. It provides room to sit, to stand, to lay down.
So did my dog's cage.
Joining me now is Reverend Kaji Dosha, co-chair of the New Sanctuary Coalition, who learned this week that Customs and Border Protection has a dossier on her and has flagged her passport due to her advocacy work tied to the migrant caravan. Also joining me is Bishop William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. Thank you both for being here. And Reverend Dosha, I want to start with you. Give us a little bit about what happened and how you wound up on essentially a watch list.
I'm not sure how I wound up on the watch list and didn't know until the story broke a couple of days ago, but I have journeyed to the border to meet with, pray for, and marry, actually officiate marriages for people as part of the migrant caravan in Tijuana. And as I was coming back from Tijuana, I was detained and interrogated by Customs and Border Patrol. If I tried.
Bishop William Barber, I know that you have also been to the border and prayed for those who are attempting to reach here and gain asylum.
Pastors, we are supposed to do exactly what Reverend Dosha is doing as clergy, speak up for the needy, the poor, those who cannot speak for themselves. One of the greatest sins in the Bible is mistreatment of the immigrant. But look at the hypocrisy, Joy. This administration on one hand talks about religious freedom because they need to keep them. Then they reminds me of a one public hate, racism,
going on with Deutsche Bank, and the fact that they're the only bank that will lend him money.
Right.
all of the other banks basically in the world have said that they won't touch him, that he has filed all of these bankruptcies. He files lawsuits. As a matter of fact, he had filed a lawsuit against Deutsche Bank, but they continue to lend him large sums of money and other members of his family. And so we started to look a little closer to see what the relationship was. And we've discovered that there was something going on with what is known as mirror trading, and that this possibly could be a way that money was being laundered.
So what is mirror trading?
Mirror trading is basically where you have maybe used by some of the oligarchs or some of the governments and the Kremlin, by which they trade money, and it is being basically traded at the same time in London, and it gets traded from, you know, the Russian money into United States money.
It sounds like money laundering.
It's money laundering.
And so essentially we just saw Paul Manafort convicted, even though he got a very short sentence, which we can talk about that in a little bit.
Yes.
But what he was essentially accused of doing was money laundering, was earning a lot of money from foreign leaders, from a lot of corrupt foreign leaders, and then hiding that money from the IRS. Could Donald Trump be in a similar spot?
He very well could be. We've got to find out a lot more about his financing. We've got to find out a lot more about something called the Panama Papers that were put out about units that were being sold basically to gangsters and to criminals out of Russia. We've got to find out more about the mirror trading that I've just alluded to. We've got to find out a lot about Mr. Manafort and his relationship to the Bank of Cyprus. That seems to have some connection even with Deutsche Bank. So there's a lot to unfold. We are, looking for information. We have requested documents. It is not a witch hunt, as he would have it described. It is, we have enough information to know that something is going on that should be exposed.
And so if you think about the people of the Kremlin, the Russian, the way that is set up, it's been described as essentially like a mafia, that you have the Kremlin operating in conjunction with oligarchs who are able to operate in the financial realm freely as long as they play ball with Vladimir Putin.
Oh,
are we
absolutely.
talking about an American oligarchy, essentially, that's operating in much the same way?
Well, we're certainly talking about the oligarchs of Russia and the Kremlin involvement. And we know things about such as Deripaski, who's involved with some of the sanctions issues that we're dealing with. So we do believe that, of course, there are those in the United States who are operating and in cooperation with some of the oligarchs of Russia, and they travel back and forth.
Right.
And so we're looking at that also.
Is there any evidence that your committee has uncovered so far that Russian money was actually funneling not just potentially into the presidential election, but into some of the congressional races as well?
I don't have that evidence yet, but we believe that this is true. And particularly, as you have heard, we believe that there have been some Russian money that was put into the NRA operation. And so a number of things are being looked at. We have 5 committees that are looking at all of this. I happen to be Financial Services. We have the Judiciary Committee. We have the Oversight Committee. We have the Foreign Affairs Committee. And we have Ways and Means looking at the tax returns. And we're meeting together, and we're trying to make sure that we are focused on each one of these issues, and we're not overlapping. I do work in in a connection with one of those committees where we are looking at Deutsche Bank.
Well, let's talk about just a little bit the businesses, because we, initially I think Donald Trump was targeting you a lot because he thought you were going to get his tax returns. He's like,
That's right.
she specifically is going to get my tax returns. We know it's another committee that's trying
That's
to get
right.
them
That's Ways and Means. That's
but
right.
one of the things that they are trying to look at is the fact that Donald Trump's business is really like 500 LLCs. That's part of the way the real estate market works. But if in fact he was using all of that complicated structure to hide money from the IRS, do we wind up in a situation where your committee needs to see his tax returns?
Well, let me just say this. We want the tax returns. I think this will reveal a lot. Now, in addition to him claiming a lot of debt, which would prevent him from having to pay taxes on much of the money that he's earned, I'm getting a lot of information sent to me unsolicited about the fact that money that he has earned has been funneled into the foundation to keep from paying taxes on it. So I'm turning some of that information over to the Attorney General here in New York.
And we saw that in Michael Cohen's public testimony, particularly the questioning by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, brought out the fact that Donald Trump may have also been inflating and deflating his assets in order to essentially maybe defraud banks and insurance companies. Is that something your committee will talk about?
Well, let me just say this. Donald Trump has told us in much of his, not testimony, but in the way that he talks about how he handles his finances, that number one, he has worked and he knows all of the tricks, and that he does not pay taxes, and he is proud of that. And so we know that he's used every trick in the book to try and avoid paying taxes. And it's very necessary for us to see exactly what he has filed.
And we have, the New York Times reported back in February that Donald Trump was actually seeking loans during the campaign. Read a little bit of that. Senior executives in New York balked, arguing that Mr. Trump's candidacy made such a loan unacceptably risky. The three people said, in fact, they feared that the bank's reputation could be harmed if the transaction were to become public because of the polarizing statements that Trump was making on the campaign trail. Have you ever seen, in the time that you've been observing politics, Congresswoman, a president of the United States actively seeking business loans and business deals and a tower in a foreign country while running for president?
Absolutely not. And this is not just the president. This is Jared Kushner, who has gotten a loan. At first we thought it was from Saudi Arabia, but now we believe it's from Qatar. While this president has been president, he was seeking out money to save some big project here in New York. That was, from here. That's right, just near here. And he did get money, and it was not Saudi Arabia, it was Qatar.
Okay, let me focus in on that, because we were very fixated on that during on this show. Jared Kushner, as we know, over-leveraged his company by purchasing a building for $1 billion, 666 Fifth Avenue, a couple blocks from Rockefeller Center. He owed a big balloon payment on that, I believe, last January. Then all of a sudden, he travels mysteriously to Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, who has worked with us very closely on national security, gets cut off. Suddenly, they're on the outs. Then he gets the money.
That's right.
And then they're back in the good graces.
That's right.
Is that something that Congress is going to investigate?
I'm very concerned about that, because it appears that Jared Kushner was first trying to get the money from Saudi Arabia, and then he did not get it, and he went to Qatar. He did not get it, and then Qatar said that that company, that organization that's responsible for their investments, literally loaned him the money, and they were not aware that they had done it. But he got the money in the middle of this presidency. And we are trying to deal with foreign affairs in a credible way all over the world. And you have the president of the United States and his family going out soliciting money from those other foreign countries that we're trying to have foreign relationships with in a credible way.
And will there be an expanded investigation? Because we know that Ivanka Trump is still getting patents in China and other countries while she is an advisor to the president of the United States. You have Don Jr.'s signature on some of those checks that Michael Cohen turned over both to Congress and to the New York Times that are showing Donald Trump was signing checks to him to reimburse him for the Stormy Daniels payment while president. Could this investigation wind up broader than Donald Trump, touching on his family?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I said there were 5 different committees that are looking at different aspects of this, and each one of what you've just alluded to may fall in one of the different committees. But for example, Mr. Cohen has already been there testifying for oversight and investigations. And they were talking about the hush money that he was involved with. So that's one aspect of it. Also, you have the Judiciary Committee that's looking at obstruction of justice and corruption. And then you have me and one other committee that's looking basically at, what has been going on with Deutsche Bank and some of his finances. And so on and on it goes. This president has basically been involved in initiation, all kinds of actions that's unheard of for the president of the United States.
And I think, as in closing, Congresswoman, I think what frustrates a lot of people about this process is that, other than you, to be blunt, members of Congress, including Democrats, will not discuss impeachment, even though impeachment would be the public hearings that would allow the public to know what you are learning. And they're all waiting on the Mueller probe. It's all being hung on Robert Mueller. Is that fair to the American people to only allow the Mueller probe to be decisive rather than initiating an impeachment hearing so that the public could find out what you guys know?
Well, I believe in the Constitution, and the Constitution gives us the authority and the responsibility to decide whether or not a president is acting in the best interest of his country. This president is not. As far as I'm concerned, he has enough violations. He's been involved in a lot of activity that we believe needs to be made apparent. And so I believe that we have everything that it needs to basically impeach him.
Yeah.
I believe that, and you're absolutely right. We're depending on Mr. Mueller. The American people should be depending on the people that they elected to represent them to determine whether or not this president is undermining the Constitution, whether or not he's acting in our best interest, and whether or not he's putting us in danger because he may be compromised in the way that he's dealing with other countries.
Congresswoman Maxine Waters, it's always great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here on set. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really
You're so
appreciate you
welcome.
being
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you. And keep it right there because we're going to have more of the potential crimes of Donald Trump, or as John Oliver puts it,
the hearings went very, very well. I believe that all of the members were satisfied with the statements and the responses that I gave to them. I told them that any additional information that they would want, they should feel comfortable to reach out to my counsel, and I would continue to cooperate to the fullest extent of my capabilities.
after spending the last 2 weeks on Capitol Hill talking to lawmakers about Donald Trump, Michael Cohen is going a step further. He's now suing the Trump Organization for breach of contract for refusing to pay $1.9 million in previously agreed to legal costs after Cohen started cooperating with federal prosecutors. The Trump Organization is calling the lawsuit a, quote, desperate money grab. Cohen has been a key figure in Trump's alleged felonies involving the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. Federal prosecutors have called it a criminal scheme directed by Trump to violate campaign finance laws by buying the silence of women alleged to have affairs with Trump in order to keep those women's stories from impacting the election. Joining me now is Nick Ackerman and Jill Wine-Banks, who both were Watergate prosecutors, as well as Paul Butler, professor at Georgetown University School of Law. Thank you all for being here. And Nick, you're here at the table with me. Sure. I want to start by getting people to understand, because I think after the Manafort sentence, a lot of people were shocked by it, and then there were those who wanted to justify it by saying, well, it's a white-collar crime. You, before you were in the Watergate world, right, you prosecuted things like tax evasion and money laundering and stuff like that. Why is that a crime that's significant to the American people?
It's extremely significant because if the tax system isn't working, we have a volunteer tax system. Money laundering is important. I mean, if people are not obeying the law, and a lot of this is self-regulatory, and you don't have a deterrent effect on this, that means that the whole system can break down.
Yeah.
Now, with respect to this particular situation with the Manafort sentencing, I mean, I think one thing that a lot of people missed is that there is a real philosophical difference between Judge Ellis and John Sirica, who is the unsung hero of the whole Watergate case.
Yeah.
And what you had there was John Sirica was willing to give the burglars enormous sentences and basically tell them he would reduce them if they cooperated.
Yeah.
Judge Ellis from day one was very hesitant, saying this whole case is here because you're trying to get Donald Trump.
Right.
He just has this philosophical bent. Two judges, both appointed by Republicans, who just come at it a different way. I certainly agree with the Sirica approach.
Yeah.
But I think, in fairness, with Judge Ellis is really not viewing this as his job to break open the case.
Do you think
which
he's being
Manafort
partisan?
could
Do you think this is straight up partisanship on his part? He's for Trump. He didn't want to put somebody away for having helped him.
I don't think that's right. I think it's a philosophical view on how he uses sentencing. Judge Sirica, on the other hand, had a completely different view. His view was a big sentence will break the case open, and that's what it did.
Yeah. And Jill Wine-Banks, you know, one of the other challenges that a lot of people have with what he did, and just to, then we'll move off of this, is that the cooperator, Michael Cohen, different judge, mind you, is getting 3 years. The non-cooperator, the anti-cooperator, gets just 1 more year than him. With time served, they could serve the same amount of time. So just as a matter of law, as a matter of advancing the cause of justice, this seemed like a complete abrogation. I will throw that to you.
You are completely right, and it does show the inequities in our sentencing system. I mean, just using the two of them, the amount of money that was hidden deliberately by Manafort, the foreign accounts that were set up, the lies that he told, all of that is much larger than what anything Michael Cohen did. Both are wrong, both are guilty, but the dimensions are much more for Manafort, and saying that he got 47 months is not enough more to show a justice. And if you compare it to the Watergate defendants, if you compare it to other white-collar criminals, Or even worse, when you compare it to what poor defendants get for much lesser crimes, you see the inequities in our system, and the sentencing guidelines were put in place so that people across the nation for similar crimes would be similarly sentenced. And when you have a dramatic downward departure like we have in this case, it reflects a bias in the judge who was throughout the trial. Judge Ellis was very hostile to the prosecution. He attacked them. He attacked one of their witnesses, Rick Gates. He said something like, obviously, Mr. Manafort didn't know enough, or he would have seen how much money you were stealing from him.
Yeah.
That is not an appropriate comment from the judge. Whereas Judge Sirica kept probing, he kept looking, and it was the fear of his sentence that led McCord, who was one of the burglary defendants, to write a letter to him saying, Your Honor, you're right. Everything was done here that was wrong. There were people who lied in the courtroom. Money was paid that was to keep us silent. He broke open the real obstruction of justice.
Yeah. Let's talk about these, specifically these campaign finance violations. I just want to get the two of you on the record about this particular judgment, Judge Ellis. I want to go to you on this, Paul Butler, because here's the other thing we need to explain to people why this is important, why it matters. We know that Michael Cohen said that there was a criminal conspiracy directed by Donald Trump to pay this hush money to Stormy Daniels and perhaps to other women to keep them quiet ahead of the election. We know from the New York Times that at least 8 checks were written that are now in the public domain, some of them written in the White House, signed by Donald Trump, signed by his son, signed by Alan Weisselberg, who took care of his money. One more piece from the New York Times, a quote, the president hosted a foreign leader in the Oval Office, then he wrote a check. He haggled over legislation, then he wrote a check. He traveled abroad, then he wrote a check. On the same day, he reportedly pressured the FBI director to drop an investigation into a former aide. The president's trust issued a check to Mr. Cohen in furtherance of what federal prosecutors have called a criminal scheme to violate campaign finance laws at Trump's direction. Why is that a crime?
So, Joy, it's not a crime for Donald Trump to pay hush money to his alleged mistresses. That's between him and Mrs. Trump. But what the evidence suggests is that these hush money payments were about trying to get Donald Trump elected in office. We know from Cohen that these conversations got heated after the Access Hollywood tapes came out. The last thing Trump needed was more evidence of his problem with women. And if the payments were on the up and up, why try to disguise them? It's always the cover-up. Trump directed Cohen, according to Mr. Cohen, to either pay the money, pretending like it was a retainer payment to him. Trump told Cohen to pay it from his home equity line so it couldn't be traced to the campaign. And we were talking about the sentencing guidelines. Jill mentioned those earlier. One reason they were so high for Paul Manafort is because it's an aggravating factor if you direct a scheme. In this case, according to the Southern District, President Trump, individual A, directed Cohen to, and again, apparently Weisselberg and Don Jr. in this illegal enterprise. The only reason Trump wasn't charged by the Southern District is because he's the president of the United States. If he had been charged, he'd have more criminal exposure than Michael Cohen.
But in the case, to that point, Nick Ackerman, Richard Nixon was going to be charged with a crime. If Donald Trump participated in a criminal scheme to violate the law, why is he not charged the way that Nixon would have been?
Well, first Nixon wasn't charged while he was in office.
Right.
And he was pardoned afterwards.
But would he have been charged?
I think he would have been charged.
In office?
No, not in office. We purposely held back on that.
Okay.
I know there were a lot of people in the office that wanted to charge him while he was in office, but Leon Jaworski made the decision because of the House Impeachment Committee that was then ongoing. The evidence was provided there, and it was his determination that that was the appropriate way to go. Now, there is nothing in the Constitution, nothing in our laws that prohibit Donald Trump from being indicted for these crimes.
In your view, can Donald Trump pardon himself?
No, I don't think he can. I think the pardon power does have certain limits. He has to execute the laws faithfully. That's what the Constitution says. It is not executing the laws faithfully to pardon yourself, pardon your son, pardon your relatives, all your co-conspirators. I don't think that's going to fly. But keep in mind, they could still file an indictment against him. There could be that would be under seal.
Right.
Because that would be totally appropriate. second law. Very
Up next, more of our coverage of the biggest political scandal in American history. You do not want to miss it. Stay with us.
This is the president speaking. I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He is a good guy. Do you know of any case where a person has been charged for obstruction of justice, or for that matter, any other criminal offense, where they said or thought they hoped for an outcome?
I don't know well enough to answer. And the reason I keep saying his words is I took it as a direction.
Right.
I mean, this is the President of the United States with me alone saying, I hope this. I took it as this is what he wants me to do.
Allegations that Trump obstructed justice intensified after former FBI Director James Comey testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Comey said that he believed Trump was directing him to drop the investigation into General Michael Flynn, who had just resigned as Trump's national security advisor after less than a month. Nearly 2 years later, Trump's former lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen testified before a House panel saying this.
Mr. Trump did not directly tell me to lie to Congress. That's not how he operates. In conversations we had during the campaign, at the same time I was actively negotiating in Russia for him, he would look me in the eye and tell me there's no Russian business, and then go on to lie to the American people by saying the same thing. In his way, he was telling me to lie.
And joining me now is Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii. She's both a member of the Judiciary and the Armed Services Committee. And Senator, thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, Joy.
So far, we know that the obstruction allegations against Donald Trump include the firing of Jim Comey due to the Russia probe, suggestions that Comey drop the Michael Flynn probe, which we just heard, the move to fire Robert Mueller, dangling pardons potentially in front of Russia probe witnesses, and wanting Cohen to lie to Congress. From what you've heard so far, just in the public record and what you've heard in committees, have you heard enough to make the allegation that Donald Trump has been guilty of obstruction of justice?
There may be more to all of the growing body of factual evidence relating to obstruction of justice, because as you know, there are 5 House committees that are investigating all of the different things that the Trump organization has been doing. And so I think that when you build a case like that, you just keep adding to it, and this may not be all that that's there for obstruction of justice. Did you mention witness tampering? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, tampering with witnesses. We haven't.
Going after Michael Cohen and by threatening that maybe his father-in-law has something to hide. So this is an entire array. And Joy, I'm glad that you're going through so much of what's going on with the Trump organization and everything that is happening, because we've never seen anything like this. I thought it was bad enough during the Nixon-Watergate time when you had a president who was concealing his crimes, and not to mention he had a vice president who was on the take before and during his time as vice president. That would be Spiro Agnew. We thought that was bad enough, but there was so much going on with what I call the Trump organization. It's not just the Trump presidency. Here's an entire organization, his foundation, his taxes, everything that we need to investigate, and I'm glad that the House is doing it.
And we know that there has been public reporting that Donald Trump, at least at some point, was being investigated, potentially being an aide of a power. It's part of the collusion. I want to play June 8, 2017. This is James Comey, the former director of the FBI, talking about a dinner that he was invited to with the president.
The dinner was an effort to build a relationship. In fact, he asked specifically of loyalty in the context of asking me to stay. My common sense told me what's going on here is that He's looking to get something in exchange for granting my request to stay in the job.
In your view, Jill Wine-Banks, is that an element of potential obstruction of justice?
I think there are so many elements. That is one of them. I would say it started even sooner than that when he fired Sally Yates. She was the first person who came forward and said to the White House, you have a problem. Flynn is subject to being compromised by the Russians. Obviously, the next step should have been that they should have acted on that, but they didn't. Instead of firing Flynn, they fired Sally Yates. They didn't want the information. That's part of the obstruction that was going on even then.
And we know that during the Watergate hearings, one of the elements of obstruction against Richard Nixon was the firing of Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor. If Donald Trump discussed with members of his cabinet firing Robert Mueller, could just discussing the idea of firing the special prosecutor be an element of obstruction?
Yes, and you also have all the evidence of his public attacks to undermine the special prosecutor. To me, that's as serious and maybe more serious than actually firing him. Firing him would be out in the open, but all of these attacks to make it look like Robert Mueller is not doing a good job, that he's off on a witch hunt, that he's politically motivated. And I want to compare it to something that happened during Watergate. The press officer for Watergate felt that in order for the American people to believe that what we were doing was honest and that we were not out for any political purposes, that the public had to know us. And he actually arranged for the trial team lawyers to have interviews with the press. And they got to know us and trust us. And I think that's important, and it's missing here where, I mean, honestly, I don't think anyone in the American public would recognize a member of the team except for Robert Mueller himself.
Yeah.
We know their names because we've seen them on indictments, but we don't know them. And so when they get attacked by the president, there's some credibility to it, and that's a serious problem.
And lastly, Jill Wine-Banks, if Donald Trump were to begin pardoning people like Paul Manafort, potentially his son-in-law, his son, would that, in your view, be an act of obstruction?
Well, yes, it would be, just as all the other dangles. I mean, we know there were conversations about pardons, and one thing you cannot do is do it for corrupt purposes. Yes, the pardon power is unlimited, but you can't take a bribe to give a pardon. If it was anybody else, even if it was not for his own benefit, he couldn't take a bribe to do it. That would be an improper use, an abuse of his power. And so I think that there are many ways in which he could violate the Constitution by doing something that is actually within his power. And he seems to be trying every which way to do it.
Jill Wine-Banks, always great to have you on the show. This time I know what your pin is. It's about the Equal Rights Amendment. We're going to have you back specifically to talk about that. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next up, we are going to get to conspiracy and collusion.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
And now we have come full circle, back to where all these investigations began. The question, did Donald Trump conspire and collude with Russians to get himself elected? Joining me now, Joe Conason, editor-in-chief of National Memo. And back with me is Paul Butler. So I'm going to start with you, Joe. The question in the Clinton impeachment was, did he conspire with his own team to lie to the American people about a sexual affair?
Right.
With Donald Trump, it's considerably more serious. We're talking about a president of the United States potentially engaged in a conspiracy with an adversary. What do you make of this entire investigation thus far?
Well, listen, Joy, if half of what appears to be true is true, about that aspect alone, this is the biggest scandal in history. The most. And when the Republic was created, that foreign powers would attempt to manipulate the government through all kinds of means. And it's taken a long time to reach the point where that actually appears to have happened. but here we are, and this is what they warned us about.
And
So,
even the sexual affairs with Clinton, that kind of became the crux of the entire argument. In this case, the sexual affairs being covered up with payoffs then becomes an element of a separate crime. But on the conspiracy piece that you've seen thus far, have you seen enough as a reporter, looking at it from a journalistic point of view, to be able to say confidently that Donald Trump's election as president of the United States was aided and abetted by a foreign government?
there's no question, Joy, that the foreign government attempted to do that. There's a lasting debate over how effective that was.
Sure.
What did it achieve in terms of a very, very narrow victory for Trump in the Electoral College? And there's a good argument made by academics and others who studied the data that it did have an impact, that the social media and other interventions by the Russians that we know occurred had a measurable effect on the election.
Yeah.
But to me, it doesn't matter whether you can prove that they swung the election for Trump or not. First of all, he lost, as we know, in the popular vote. But what matters is that they tried to do it, and what matters is that it's clear that his campaign welcomed that assistance,
Yeah.
instead of reporting it to the FBI as